Hello, team. All right, so we're going to get started with our work today. First things first, I want to remind you that your log number 2 is due in 2 days. That's your homework. All right. So if you have any issues with that, if you can't access the log options, whatever, let me know. I'll help you out. So today, we're going to be reviewing figurative language. I know we've been talking about that for a couple of days. And then we're going to be talking about something new called connotative language. All right. So I'm going to run you through that. We're going to talk about what it is. I'm going to give you lots of examples. And then we're going to actually go back to the metamorphosis and we're going to do some work trying to find that connotative language. All right. So I'll do a few examples in this video, but if you need extra help, you can always ask me to have a Zoom meet. You can email me, whatever it is you need to do. All right. So our expectations are the usual ones. You guys really don't need me to run over them. And we want to review figurative language. So I'm going to ask you to just think about this for yourself for a minute, and then I'll give you some answers. So what is a simile? What is a metaphor? And what is imagery? All right, so we know a simile is when we are comparing two things and we're using the words like or as to do it, okay? A metaphor is when we're comparing two things and we're not using the words like or as. We might be using is, was, were, things like that, okay? And imagery is just anything really descriptive about the five senses. So what you see, what you hear, what you touch, etc. All right, so that's figurative language. So now let's talk about connotative language, okay? And if you were in the room, we would do this with your group, but we're not. So I'm going to ask you to just kind of think to yourself, all right? So if I said the word slimy, what would you think of when you think of that word? If I said the word shimmery, what would you think of when you hear that word? And if I said the word soft, what do you think of when you hear that word? Okay, so let's go back to these now. When you thought of the word slimy, I don't know what came up for you, but for me, I thought about like gooey, messy, maybe even a little sticky. I thought of a slug. I thought of like kind of disgusting. It really had like a negative, it felt negative to me. When we got to the word shimmery, I was thinking about like maybe something is bright, or maybe something is like fancy. I was thinking also of like stars. I was thinking of like a really pretty like prom dress. So that one felt also kind of positive to me. And then when we got to the word soft, I was thinking about like how when I was a kid, I had a teddy bear that was soft, and I would always hug my teddy bear, and it made me feel safe, and it made me feel comforted, and it made me feel protected. So soft felt positive to me also. All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what these three words have in common. And yes, they all start with S, but what else do they have in common? So what they have in common is that they are all connotative language. So connotative language is any word or phrase that brings up ideas and emotions associated with it. So our connotations for the word soft were safe and comforted, all right? Or our connotations for the word slimy would be messy gooey, right? So it's whatever associations or relate like connections you're thinking of when you think of that word or that phrase. So let's try it again. When you hear the word freedom, what are the connotations that come up for you? What do you think of? So I personally, when I hear the word freedom, I think America. I think about privilege. I think about Black Lives Matter and especially the protests that were happening this spring. I think of feminism. I think of slavery. You know, my associations are kind of like either the people who do really have freedom or people who don't. That tends to be what comes up for me, but it might be totally different for you. It might be that when you hear freedom, you think about education or relationships or getting out of your house or whatever that looks like for you. Okay, so let's get down to our work. And if you're doing this on your computer, which you probably are, I'll show you how to do this highlighter situation in just a second. If you happen to actually have printed this, then you want to grab two highlighter colors or a highlighter and a pen or two different pens or whatever, something so that you can differentiate. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to actually go through part 2 of the metamorphosis, or part of it. And first, we're going to do examples of figurative language, and then we're going to highlight examples of connotative language. So how it's going to work is I'm going to read our 3 paragraphs out loud. If you feel comfortable highlighting while I do that, that's great. If you want to wait until we do that together, that's fine too. And then, you know, normally in class we would share out with each other. So I'll share with you some of the examples that I found. Okay. And then you'll keep going through part 2 for yourself. Okay. So, excuse me. So I want to point out the expectation is that you continue reading all of part 2. Okay. All right. So if you're working on your computer, you're going to open up your document, and I'm working in Microsoft Word, so this might look a little bit different for you. And if you need help figuring it out, let me know. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually type here, actually below my key. I'm going to put my key here. So figurative language, oops. I cannot type, guys. Okay, so I'm going to create my key. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to choose my highlighter color by clicking on this little arrow. And I think I want to do green. And then I'm going to make sure that this is clicked right here. And that's going to be my color for figurative language. So I'm just going to go like that, and then it'll highlight it for me. And then I'm going to come back up where I was before to the arrow. I'm going to change the color. I want to do pink. And that's going to be my connotative. Okay, so we're going to do figurative first. So you need to make sure that you change it back to your first color. And excuse me, I'm going to read the first 3 paragraphs together, and then we're going to go through and look for some figurative language, right? Okay. It was not until dark that evening that Gregor awoke from his deep and coma-like sleep. He would have woken soon afterwards anyway, even if he had not been disturbed, as he had had enough sleep and he felt fully rested. But he had the impression that some hurried steps and the sound of the door leading into the front room being carefully shut had woken him. The light from the electric street lamps shone palely here and there, the light from the electric street lamps shone palely here and there onto the ceiling and the tops of the furniture. But down below, where Gregor was, it was dark. He pushed himself over to the door, feeling his way clumsily with his antenna, of which he was now beginning to learn the value, in order to see what had been happening there. The whole of his left side seemed like one painfully stretched scar, and he limped badly on his 2 rows of legs. One of the legs had been badly injured in the events of the morning. It was nearly a miracle that only one of them had been, and it dragged along lifelessly. It was only when he'd reached the door that he realized what it was that had actually drawn him over to it. It was the smell of something to eat. By the door there was a dish with sweetened milk with little pieces of white bread floating in it. He was so pleased he almost laughed, as he was even hungrier than he'd been that morning, and immediately dipped his head into the milk, nearly covering his eyes with it. But he soon drew his head back again in disappointment. Not only did the pain in his tender left side make it difficult to eat the food, he was only able to eat if his whole body worked together as a snuffling whole. But the milk did not taste at all nice. Milk like this was normally his favorite drink, and his sister had certainly left it there for him because of that. But he turned, almost against his own will, away from the dish and crawled back into the center of the room. Through the crack in the door, Gregor could see that the gas had been lit in the living room. His father at this time would normally be sat with his evening paper, reading it in a loud voice to Gregor's mother and sometimes his sister. But there was now not a sound to be heard. Gregor's sister would often write and tell him about this reading, but maybe his father had lost the habit in recent times. It was so quiet all around, too, even though there must have been somebody in the flat. What a quiet life it is the family lead, Gregor said to himself, and gazing into the darkness, felt a great pride that he was able to provide a life like that in such a nice home for his sister and parents. But what now, if all this peace and wealth and comfort should come to a frightening end? That was something Gregor did not want to think about too much, so he started to move about, crawling up and down the room. Okay, so let's pause and go back and look for some figurative language. So pause the video, take some time, look for what you think might be some figurative language. Okay, so here are some of the ones I found. I'm not going to do all three paragraphs, but I am going to do a few. So one of the things that stuck out to me was deep and coma-like sleep. And if you are trying to differentiate between types of figurative language, that's a simile because it's using like, right? I also really felt like some hurried steps was a good piece of imagery. I felt like that was really describing, like I can just hear what those steps sound like in my brain. And then I also thought that this whole sentence here, the whole of his left side seemed like one painfully stretched scar, and he limped badly on his 2 rows of legs. That's such a great piece of imagery. I feel like I can really see him like wincing in pain and trying to figure out how to move. So that's my figurative language. And now I'm going to come back to connotative. So I'm going to make sure to change my color. And I found a few here that I want to point out. Again, I'm not going to do all 3 paragraphs. One of the ones that I found was this word clumsily. So the association that brings up for me is like somebody who's kind of awkward, who doesn't really have their balance. It makes me think about me when I was in middle school. It makes me also think like not being very like smart or good at stuff sometimes. So clumsily has all these associations with it that came to my brain. And overall, I feel like it's a negative thing. So that's why I put connotative. I also thought that a really good one, and there are some other ones in here, but another really good one is the word miracle. Because miracle to me is very clear. Like that means God, the Bible, Jesus. That means like this thing was not supposed to happen and then it did. Like it's kind of unthinkable and amazing. And like you can't really figure out what the logical explanation would be. So that for me had a lot of really strong connotations. And so I decided that I wanted to highlight that one. Okay. So you might have had some different ones. You might have not had the ones that I had. You might have more. That's great. So we're going to be talking more about it tomorrow. And I want to make sure that you remember you need to go back and you need to do this with more of part 2. Okay. I know part 2 is kind of long. So if you can do at least 2 more pages, then you'll be good to go. All right. If you have any questions, make sure you let me know. You ask me about it. You send me an email. You send me a remind, whatever that is for you. Okay. Oh no. Still. Here we go. Woo.